This is our third lecture on the First World War. We left the war beginning in 1914 and 1915, where the soldiers on particularly the Western Front are beginning to find that the tactics used in previous wars are just leading to mindless slaughter and lots of people dying and all sorts of problems because of the machine guns and the high rate of fire and the accurate rifles, so that they're finding to dig deeper into the ground in order to be able to find some sort of protection for themselves. What was life like in the trenches? The trench system that develops on the Western Front was a near continuous line that ran from the North Sea in Belgium all the way through Belgium, France, down to the Alps in Switzerland, 475 miles long. The trenches themselves were a series of horizontal running positions connected by vertical trenches to other supporting trenches in the rear. And so you can see on the picture, you can have the horizontal positions of both sides here connected by vertical trenches going back to other horizontally running positions, right, facing each other. They averaged about 275 yards apart, one side's trenches across from the other, so about 2 3/4 football fields. But that could be different depending on where that was, and most importantly on the terrain. Some places could be separated by a lot longer. Some places along the Western Front, soldiers described being able to hear the enemy speaking very clearly because they were that close together. What's important to understand and what makes World War One different from other conflicts is that the fighting within World War One is contained within a very thin corridor. We don't see the big, giant, dramatic troop movements that we're used to when we're talking about wars that we'll see again in World War Two, where the fighting is really contained within a small, thin corridor, 4 to 5 miles behind the front lines. It's like there's not even a war going on in some places. So we gave you a looking down view. This is a little bit more of a oblique view, and you can kind of see some of the again the trench system that has developed with the German trench system in the back. You can see again the horizontal positions with the vertical trenches, right, going backwards, just to be able to protect yourself and only be able to kind of pop your head up from there. Right? Life in the trenches was said to be marked by periods of vast boredom, punctuated with acute terror and horror. And that's what the trench life is like for these soldiers, where they're not doing a whole lot. It's boring, it's wasteful, and then they've got an attack or they have an attack, and then it's terrifying and horrific. The soldiers in the trenches feel very dehumanized. The armies going into World War One are very colorful with bright colors and fancy headdresses and um, kind of shiny metal. A cavalry soldier in the French army, it was said, could hop in a time machine and travel back to the medieval ages battlefield and wouldn't feel very out of place. Those soldiers are cut to ribbons in 1914 very easily. And so we see all of the combatants by 1915 and 1916 adapting brown, olive green, steel gray uniforms to protect themselves in these environments. So the soldiers kind of lose themselves in this, in their drab uniforms, and losing all of their kind of uniqueness from there. The trench system is fighting in semi-amphibious warfare here. Water was a constant presence in the trenches. Very, very, very few, if any, had any sort of covering over the top, so the rain would just come down. In a lot of places, particularly in the north by Belgium, the water table, the water under the ground, is very, very close to the surface. And so soldiers describe putting in a shovel, picking up the dirt, and then another shovel full, and you're already in water. And then imagine having to dig down 4 or 5 feet from there. And so that was a constant getting in from there. The loss of identity and the dehumanization by the soldiers was reflected in the nicknames they gave themselves. The French poilus, or the shaggy ones, the German front swine, or front swine pigs of the front, the British Tommy Atkins, or Tommies. Tommy Atkins was the example name put on a lot of the recruitment forms and signing up paperwork. And so the British kind of go up there. And then again, Americans were dubbed the Doughboys, and the rationale and reason behind that is very disputed. But that's what they all came up there. For most of the soldiers, they were marked with 1 month rotations, 1 week in the front line, where you're right in the thick of it, right in danger. 1 week in reserve, so you're still pretty close to the front, but you're not constantly in kind of a deep threat of danger. And then 2 weeks in the rear, where you can rest, relax before being from there. And these 1 month rotations become pretty much standard by the end of the war. The soldiers in the trenches are surrounded by an omnipresence of death. Bodies are constantly being killed by the fighting. But bodies are being buried by giant shells. They're being exhumed by more shells coming from there, and so the soldiers always have these bodies constantly surrounding them from there. Infections were common in the trenches because there's all this dirt and blood and bodies and rotting flesh and all these things from there. Soldiers, because they were constantly fighting in water, right, would not be able to change their shoes or let their feet dry out or let their socks change. So they would get a condition called trench foot, where basically your foot kind of puffs up and then just kind of rots, the flesh rots away because of all the stuff from there. Infections were common. Particularly, there was no real doctors and surgeons said there's really no way for a soldier getting wounded within the trenches to not get some sort of infection, particularly with you have like shrapnel or bullets going through all any of this other stuff. So it's not that wonderful or great. So what we have at the beginning of the war is soldiers, these Germans or these French soldiers, marked with these kind of very colorful, uh, very shiny, very showy uniforms, and these guys are going to end up killed very easily. It's easy to see bright red on the battlefield, and so what we end up seeing by the end of the war is olive olive drab, khaki, the steel gray of the Germans, and that's what they begin to move to, and where you really can't. All these guys kind of look all the same here in this cart, and that's what this picture's going to go and show you. So the trench system runs from the English Channel, the North Sea in Belgium, and roughly along this line. This is kind of showing 1914 here, but this is where it's going to stabilize from there. The fighting's going to go a little bit this way, it's going to go a little bit that way, but it's really contained within this thin corridor for large portions of the war. The soldiers are fighting some days for inches gained, right? Miles gained is a huge kind of victory from there. The trench system in kind of a diagram form is on the left, where again you have your horizontal trenches connected by communications, trenches to support trenches, and trenches in the rear. So if you're attacking and one is over from, and that's shown again in the picture on the right, which is actual the trench system from there. These trenches will be heavily fortified. The idea is to protect yourself from an advancing enemy. So if you're trying to attack Mr. Cranmer in his trench here, you would have to run across yards, football fields worth of length of what was called no man's land, where no man was, or no one was expected to survive between there, run up into barbed wire entanglements in front of the trenches, cut your way through or get your way through there, then meet the first front line trench with soldiers shooting at you. And then if you get there, another support trench, and then a reserve trench after that. All the while, there's machine guns shooting their bullets that way, and you have long range artillery from the enemy dropping shells along this entire way. And so as you can start to imagine, the defenders had an extraordinarily um, safe and supportive system from which to defend their places from. This is what a typical British soldier would be carrying with them, particularly in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And so that's kind of the stuff from there. And this is the trenches that they'd be doing with. And this is kind of a nicer British one that they have. But you can see soldiers who are trying to get any sort of rest or sleep that they can. Someone just kind of barely picking up their head, but you can see just how deep these trenches are in order to be able to find protections. If you were to poke your head up over the trench, what would you see? Well, you wouldn't be able to see the Germans or the enemy over there because they'd be down underneath their trenches that way. So you can see a couple of different examples of the trenches set up there. And so soldiers would either stand behind a big, huge, giant steel plate in order to protect themselves, look over, or rig up some periscopes or some reflecting mirrors to be able to go and look over that way. And so, just some different examples of just the soldiers. Some of the trenches were very well built, and from there, some were just lines in the ground. Some, like this picture on the left, were just connected uh, craters from the explosions going on from the big giant guns. The Allied powers remarked that the German trenches were always much cleaner and much nicer, and more importantly, much drier. And that was mainly because when the fighting sort of stabilized in the fall of 1914, the Germans won, occupied the high ground, meaning that the water drained down into the Allied trenches, and they spent a lot more time fixing them and pouring concrete and having a lot more wood from there. And so the German trenches were a little bit nicer than all the other ones. In front of all the trenches would be barbed wire. Now, barbed wire had been a recent addition, coming out of DeKalb, Illinois in the 1860s, 1870s in order to be able to kind of keep cattle within. But this barbed wire would be strewn over the top, or more importantly, in front to kind of create this spider's web or this big, huge, giant, massive nest of all this kind of wire from there. Some of this had not just kind of metal pokes, metal or steel or pokes like from there. Some of it was razor wire or had razor sharp razor blades, right, coming from there. A lot of the artillery shells and bombardments that were used to be able to do this. The sole purpose was to try to cut this wire from there. But again, because it's barbed wire, it's kind of like a big giant slinky with just barbs on it. The explosions, the soldiers would say, would just lift the barbed wire up off the ground, have it come back down and tangle it into even more knots and nastiness that they would have to fight through while they're being shot at by the enemy. Water was everywhere. You can see in the mud and the muck and the stuff, and imagine what starts to happen and when all these shells are going off, or guys aren't going to want to have to run all the way to where the bathroom is. They're just going to let it fly right out the front of their trench there. So imagine what happens if you slip and fall into this, or you get pushed into this, or this stuff splashes into your face, all the blood and the guts and all the nastiness that's in this water that people are having to kind of navigate through and work their way through from there. Um, as they moved into places like Ypres and Passchendaele, the mud was said to be so bad it would swallow guys up from there. Horses would take a misstep and be swallowed all the way up from there. As again, you can kind of see just a little bit. The water is all over the place. Another constant presence was rats. Rats would be all over, and the soldiers described the rats being an omnipresence along with the skulls and the dead bodies along the way. And the rats would constantly be feeding off the dead bodies and all the other detritus of war. And they would have, again, you can see this is one dog's rat total through one night. A French soldier said, "You eat beside the dead, you drink beside the dead, you relieve yourself beside the dead, and you sleep beside the dead within the trench system." The bodies are all over the place, particularly when some of these more battles of 1916 are done. And from the Somme, you can start to see all the piles of human remains that begin to pile up across the Western Front from there. And that's just the soldiers who are kind of getting out of it. Again, you have a high number of different ways from there. Soldiers are getting shot at, they're getting trench foot, they're getting infected from all the different things from there. We're going to take a slight little jolt here. We want to understand is the question becomes how did the Allies use their colonial empires, right, in World War One? Well, they used them for raw materials, but more importantly, they used them for soldiers. You can see particularly from the British Empire, just how many soldiers from around the world were called from those overseas territories to the Western Front from there. You can see 1.5 million Indians were called from British India to serve in the Western Front in Europe. The 1914 British Army, the old territorial army that's gone all around the world and fought all these different battles, is gone. right? They were sacrificed to slow the German assault, and so they have to come up with a brand new. They're called the Kitchener armies. Be able to go and figure that out, and it's helped and supplemented by these troops from all over. It is said that the Western Front in World War One was probably featuring some of the most culturally diverse place in all the world. This is from a German prison camp on the Western Front, and you can see all the different soldiers from all over the world who are captured by the Germans, right? From Vietnamese to African soldiers, right? To soldiers from all over, including the British Isles themselves. And so again, you have all these soldiers coming there. This is a New Zealand Maori regiment performing the haka, the traditional war dance of the Maori people. In a display from there, you have um, soldiers coming from India, Russian Cossacks, Chinese laborers, people from Vietnam, Cambodian soldiers for the French. The French brought in Africans from Senegal, from suburban Africa, from North Africa, and not only do you have soldiers from all over the world serving, you have to remember that the truck and the automobile is still relatively new. And so, how did the British Army and all these other armies function? They function on horseback by horsepower from there. And so, you have millions of horses dying and being used throughout the war from all different sides. On top of that, you have other animals like dogs. No, these aren't the famous flying dogs of World War One. These would be messenger dogs to be able to relay messages uh, up to the front lines or back. And some of the dogs include the famous Sergeant Stubby. Sergeant Stubby was the highest decorated military dog in United States history. Sergeant Stubby kind of found his way into the front lines. Sergeant Stubby was able to alert his um, owner and his troop that he was with of a gas attack. Sergeant Stubby even captured a German soldier trying to sneak into the trenches by jumping up on him, grabbing him, and not letting him go. He was the most highly decorated dog in American history, like we said, and he even meant General John J. Blackjack Pershing, right, the leader of the American Expeditionary Force when the Americans finally show up there. You have other dogs performing rolling off and running off telegraph and telephone lines, uh, pigeons who would go and take pictures over any lines and return back. Obviously, if you have all these animals, you need fetch, and then there's a cute picture of a cat on there. Elephants would be used in the war as well, particularly when Germany, when they don't need all these circus elephants or elephants in zoos, they'd be used to plow fields because all the horses were gone, or have machine guns strapped to their back. Right, from there. Camels were used, other in places, and even apparently that owl there. So why were they soldiers forced in the trenches for the different technology? One was through the use of artillery. Artillery is big, long guns firing from long ways away. And the soldiers on the Western Front describe constant explosions from these long range guns. We see tremendous expenditures of ammunition in order to be able to support some of these offensives. For example, at the British Battle of the Somme, the British got together 2.9 million shells and fired 1.5 million of them on the Germans over a 7-day period. This represents 21,000 tons of explosives fired by over 50,000 gunners for a week. Imagine being on the receiving end of that. The goal of these artillery bombardments were to soften the enemy defenses before attacking the enemy, drive them from their positions, cut up the barbed wire, make it easier for the soldiers to advance from there. As we can imagine, it's not pleasant to be on the receiving end of this. And soldiers whose nerves were kind of and stressed out from this would get a term called shell shock. What we acknowledge today was most probably post-traumatic stress disorder. Uh, but in World War One, they thought it was literally from your body couldn't take all the different constants and pounding from there. A direct hit from one of these artillery shells would obliterate a person into nothing. You wouldn't be able to find any sort of scraps of anything to be able to put together in an envelope to send back. And so when we say some of these soldiers were missing, missing would mean that, I mean, you just weren't there at all. Like you literally weren't on this plane of existence. A near miss from one of these artillery shells would cause concussive waves that of the tremendous changes in air pressure from these explosives that would travel through your body and could rupture your internal organs without ripping open the body in any way, shape, or form. This becomes a common trope that you'll see in World War One and World War Two movies, where the hero and his buddy will be on the receiving end of a lot of artillery fire, and then it'll die off. The hero will go and turn his buddy over and say, "Hey, what's wrong?" He looks fine, but the artillery has interrupted there. You would think this would be pretty great to have. However, there were a lot of problems with it. One, it was hard to communicate observable fire. It was hard to communicate from the front lines where the artillery shells were landing. So if you're a mile or so back and you're just firing off into a map space on a grid, it's hard to be able to say, no, move it to an inch left or an inch right from that, particularly when you're being shot at that way. The soldiers on the receiving end of the artillery would just dig their trenches and their dugouts deeper. The Germans would fortify them with steel rebar and concrete. So then again, you're needing almost direct hits would not injure or cause enough problems. And if we take the example of the Somme for just one example, if you're the Germans and you're for 7 days receiving 1.5 million shells, you're probably going to imagine that's exactly where the British are coming. And so that allows you to be able to move your troops from there. It's like ringing a big, huge, giant dinner bell saying, hey, here's where the enemy is attacking right at this point right here where we're firing all our shells from. As you probably can imagine, to get 1.5 million shells to the front, you have to make all of them. So what we see back in the home front is all these people making that. Who's putting these shells together? Well, most of the men are off fighting the war, and so that means that women munition workers were the ones who would be going and doing this. And if you can imagine, if these are all filled with explosives, if one of those accidentally explodes, it's not going to be pretty well to be on the receiving end of any of these. One of the dangers, one of the two dangers that female munition workers faced while putting these shells together, one was the constant threat of explosions. Any wrong move could again set off one explosion here is going to set off a chain reaction of all those. And two, the chemicals that they were using in order to be able to make these shells become explosive would poison the female munition workers, cause their hair to fall out, cause them to physically turn yellow. Think like Tweety Bird, and they'd be called yellow canaries, right, in the streets, cause them to be physically sick and lead to other complications from there. If one of those shells goes off, it's not going to be pretty great to be on the receiving end. This was one of the worst disasters where this factory lost all of its workers when a shell went off inside the factory and set off all the other ones. You can see that it's not there, and this is on the other side of the harbor from that explosion. Show you how that is. So where are all these shells going? They're going into these big guns, and these big guns are then purposed to be able to go and send them out. And again, when you're trying, some of these shells you can't lift by one person. They're several hundred pounds, and you're able to go from there. So there's a dog, just to give you some sort of way to be able to put this together. And those weren't even some of the smaller ones. The Germans developed railway guns that could shoot shells 37,000 yards, right? And again, into the hundreds of pounds from there. And so again, you're looking at a shell that's maybe 400 pounds, half the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, being able to drop shells from there. Some of the biggest railway guns for Germany would fire the shell, and the recoil shooting back would drive it a mile down the track. So then they have to bring it a mile back to where it was, put it back in place, and shoot that way, which is what this gun would shoot. This particular railroad gun was putting shells into like near sub, like up into the stratosphere, into the high reaches of the Earth's atmosphere before coming and slamming back down into Earth. They spent a heck of a lot of these shells, shooting all of them off. So you can just see the piles and piles of them amassing from there. Because again, as a French soldier said, artillery was the killer, artillery was the terrifier. You don't know where these shells are going to land. You can just hear them coming, and all you can do is kind of hope and pray from there. And again, these are all happening at all hours of the night. These three pictures here were all taken at midnight. So you can imagine trying to get any sort of sleep when all of these shells are shrieking and landing from there. And each one of those lines in the picture is going to result into an explosion that looks something similar to this as it's going off from there. The shells could do extraordinary damage. You can see here in Belgium, the before, and in France, one of the forts of Verdun, the before, and then again the after of the moonscape that these big giant artillery shells do to the landscape from there. Some of these battlefields from the First World War look exactly the same, right, as they did um, in the time of the war, and they're still pockmarked by these shell holes, and they're still digging some of these shells out every year. Another major technology was machine guns. Now, the machine gun itself was perfected by the American Hiram Maxim in 1884. The idea that, again, every time the bullet fires off, that drives a mechanism that reloads a bullet so it keeps doing it over and over again. The machine gun, though, in the late 1800s was dismissed mostly by European generals as only a weapon to slaughter natives in the colonies. It was a weapon to be able to be brought into as part of the imperial domination, so that where these hundreds of natives can be able to go and be slaughtered in front of these machine guns. And this is proven a couple places. The famous one is the British Battle of Omdurman in 1898, where several hundred British soldiers equipped with Maxim machine guns were able to fight off thousands of uh, African warriors who were descending upon them. And then again, the United States at the Battle of Wounded Knee in the 1890s massacred a whole bunch of Sioux Native Americans with machine guns from there. By the time we move into World War One, the machine guns have a range of 1,000 yards and can fire 600 rounds per minute, 1,000 yards downrange, and they're deadly at 1,000 yards. And so these soldiers are running sometimes into a literal wall of steel from these bullets, and they're expected to be able to go through there. These guns are kind of fed by these belts of ammunition. So think of a long string of bullets being fed into the gun. And because these guns are shooting for so long, remember every time a bullet fires down the barrel of a gun, that's an explosion. And so repeated explosions, 600 explosions per minute, are going to cause the metal to heat up. And so some of these guns were placed inside of a you can think of a jacket or kind of a bigger barrel filled with water that was constantly being refilled so that the cold water could cool down and keep the gun from warping and changing from there. The British developed what they call the 2-inch chop, where a soldier would hit the barrel of the gun, kind of in a karate chop motion, to be able to sweep the gun from side to side, creating a wall of bullets for the enemy to come into. What the machine guns create is industrial death. And so we talked about this idea of progress throughout this semester. And so with the machine guns, the soldier at the end of the gun is no longer a skilled marksman who's trained his entire life to be able to put this thing there. They're just pushing a button. And so you're moving away from the soldier at the end of the machine gun from skilled marksman to becoming just an operator, tasked with pointing the gun in the right directions and making sure more bullets go in there than having any sort of real skill from there. Again, the machine guns would sweep away enemies, troops advancing into its direction from side to side as it had them advancing in front of them. So again, several of these machine guns would be used. You can kind of see the Germans here have it in front of behind the barbed wire. So the troops advancing in it would again be met with all of these different stuff from there. And again, the machine guns would kind of be targeted because of how deadly they were on the battlefield. So the machine gun is a pretty simple thing. It's fed, like we said, with belts of ammunition into there and shooting it out there. And again, the barrel doesn't need to be that thick. It's the same thing like any other gun barrel, but this barrel is surrounded by with somewhere either air to help kind of cool down the expansion, or with literally water to help keep the gun cool as it went from there. Um, I'm going to show you a clip here from the movie All Quiet on the Western Front from 1930, which kind of again just shows you how deadly the machine guns could be on the battlefield. Then another clip is going to be from the movie War Horse, which again kind of illustrates the same point what we're talking about with the machine guns. So in the scene from Warhorse here, that really plays into a lot of what you'll see a lot in the post-war literature, or what soldiers will talk about, or what movies will portray, is this idea of, well, what good does heroism, what good does courage, what good does bravery do when you have so many bullets flying in the air that they're literally hitting each other, as this picture shows. And that again is what really drives the motivation for the soldiers to find any sort of protection amongst the trenches, which drives the trench warfare of World War One. And we'll see in our next slide, sorry, our next lecture, how we're able to, how they try to come up with some ways in order to solve this seemingly mindless slaughter.